Welcome back. This is day 2 of the 7-day outline challenge, and here is where our work is going to begin in earnest. So today we're going to be talking about the story framework, more specifically setting the bare bones of the entire plot for your novel, just to give a quick glance over idea of what the entire story is going to be about that you can reference as you go along with the outline process, but we'll get really more specific later on in this challenge. So today's discussion is going to cover what the story framework is and what pieces are included in it, the different elements that belong in each different part of the framework, and then we will go in and I'll give you an example of what the framework looks like when it's written down and, completed as a written outline that you can actually look at. So, the purpose of framing the story is really made up of 3 things. The first is that the framework allows the story to keep its focus. It helps you as the author to center the plot around one idea and then keep it within the lines of that idea and not veer off course. It also develops the plot's flow in the way that it sets the direction that the story path is going to follow. And once you have that kind of set in stone, you know as you're writing the story which direction you need to be moving in, so you can recognize that if you're kind of veering off course a little in the writing and get back to where you should be. And thirdly, framing the story, it helps you to understand where each of the main events in your story are going to occur. I mean, you get more specifics on this again later in the outlining process, but as you write this down, you know when this event is going to happen, like in which part of the story, and then more specifically, as we'll learn later in this presentation, which part of the section of the story frame. I realize that is a little confusing right now, but I promise it's going to make more sense as we go along in this presentation. So there's 3 main purposes of creating and framing the story. It is to focus the plot, to develop the plot's flow, and to understand when the main events are going to occur. So let's take a look at the elements that go into the framework. Every story is told in really 3 parts. And so, really simply put, that is what your framework is. You are dividing your entire story into a brief outline in 3 parts. So, in part 1, this is where, the protagonist is introduced, and we start to understand and develop the journey that the protagonist is about to embark on. And it segues then into them stepping out the door and embarking on that quest, leading into part 2, where they're going to learn the first big lesson from a mentor. They're going to encounter like their first big obstacle. They're going to also be distracted from their goal or tempted away from it right before they experience the worst moment they have ever experienced to date in the story. And then that leads us into part 3, where the character is then going to face that main conflict in that darkest moment that they're facing. Fight through it, then deal with the aftermath of having just fought a physical or a metaphorical battle, depending on what your story type is. And finally, then you wrap up the story in part 3 at the end. So that is the elements of the story framework. Part 1, part 2, part 3. Now, the 3 parts of the frame in a little bit more depth. Part 1 of the novel is going to be the beginning. Let's think about every story has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has the end. Well, to make the outline simple, think of part 1, part 2, and part 3 as the beginning, the middle, and the end. So the beginning is really your introduction to the character, to the world that they live in, to the journey that they're going to be taking, to the problem that they're going to be facing. Then you move into the middle, which is part 2, and we start to see the characters' goals and conflicts enacted out, pushing that plot forward, leading them to part 3, which is that final confrontation and ultimately the resolution of the story in the end of the book. Now, there's 4 parts to a novel that you will see throughout the 3 parts of the framework. And these 4 parts are the introduction, the crisis, the climax, and the resolution. In the introduction, again, this is the beginning of the story. You want to make it clear who the main characters are and really focus on the world that they're living in and the journey that they're going to take throughout the story. You want the readers to connect with that main character, ideally your protagonist. And then as we start to segue into more of the middle of the book and into part 2 of our framework, we reach the crisis. And these are the points in the book where the characters' goals begin to collide with the challenges they're facing. And every time they set a goal, they meet a conflict, and it ends in disaster. So on and so forth until we reach that darkest moment, the pit of doom that your character falls in, that they have to climb out of, and then face that main overreaching conflict that has been a part of your plot from the beginning, but is just now becoming quite clear. And the character is going to take care of that in the climax of the book. And this is also in the middle in part 2 of the book. Finally, we're going to reach the resolution where the character is overcoming the main conflict and then has to come to terms with everything in order to get back to where they were. Your character is going to change throughout the course of the book. So to say that they're going to get back to normal is kind of misleading because they're not going to be the same person as they were at the start of the book. But after this final conflict and cleaning up the aftermath, ideally, your character will get to a place of inner peace with what has happened and go about the rest of their life or day or whatever as your story ends. So to take a look here at the framework in action. So when you write it down, part 1 is going to have the introduction to the character, the introduction to the problem that they're facing, and the transition into them taking that first action of actually starting their journey. So I didn't give real life examples in this just because that can get a little confusing, but when you outline this, you're not going to want to say introduction to the character. I mean, get specific, write down your protagonist's name, the world that they live in, who their friends are, the problem that they're going to be facing, and the transition into taking action. Like, what is the problem they face, and what is that first action they take? That's all going to be your part 1. Moving on to part 2, get specific about the different crises and goals that your character are setting and the conflicts that they're going to face over and over and over again on their quest. And then you want to transition into that worst possible place that they could find themselves in right before the climax of the book. So the middle is really about the character setting a goal, experiencing a conflict, that conflict ending in a disaster, the character reacting to it and setting a new goal, so on and so forth, until they finally reach the point of that main overreaching challenge that they have to face. And then finally, the end of the book in part 3, you're resolving the problem. The confrontation in the climax is over, and whatever happened, happened. So now you're playing cleanup. And the aftermath, once everything's done, is what happened to the character, how is the story going to end. Those are the details you want to include here in your outline. So at a glance, part 1 is the introduction to the character, the problem they're facing, and a transition to action. Part 2 is the crisis the characters are facing, the transition to their worst possible place, and the climax. And part 3 is the resolution and the aftermath. So again, get specific when you do this, because as many details as you can put in, the easier the outlining process is going to be later. So homework today. Yep, that's right. I am assigning you some homework. I want you to create your own framework for your own novel. So the idea that you came up with yesterday and committed to on day 1, I hope you wrote it down and that you actually committed to the idea that you want to run with, because today I want you to create the framework using the steps I've just outlined of separating it into 3 parts, part 1, part 2, part 3, or the beginning, the middle, and the end, and start outlining that idea into a framework that you can use as we move on with this challenge. And I am going to leave tomorrow's lesson up, for surprise. So I will catch you all tomorrow. Thank you so much again for attending, and I look forward to teaching you again some more on the outlining process in our next day.